On the evening of April 8, 2026, the United States and Iran signed a ceasefire that was supposed to stop one of the most dangerous military conflicts the Middle East had seen in many years, and the entire world believed that announcement meant the crisis was finally over. Oil markets dropped sharply because traders and governments thought the energy situation was ending, and that oil tankers would start moving again through the world's most important waterway. But here is the thing that almost no news report explained clearly that night, and it has nothing to do with missiles or military plans. Before the next morning even arrived, Iran's Revolutionary Guard shut the Strait of Hormuz again, the same passage that carries 20% of the world's entire oil supply every single day, and every tanker trying to leave the Persian Gulf was stopped right where it sat. The ceasefire had been signed, but the strait was closed, and the whole world needed to know who was actually in control. Before we get into what happened after the ceasefire, we need to talk about what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, and why it matters so much to every single country on Earth. Because most people have heard the name, but do not fully understand how much of the world depends on this one passage every day. The strait sits between Iran and Oman, and it is only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, which makes it one of the smallest but most relied upon passages in the entire world for global energy. Before this war started in late February 2026, this corridor was moving approximately 20 million barrels of oil every single day, which was about 20% of all the oil traded across the world's oceans. It was also moving 20% of the world's total liquefied natural gas supply, most of which was coming from Qatar and heading to buyers in Europe and Asia. In 2024, approximately 84% of all crude oil going through the strait was heading to Asian markets, and China alone was getting 1/3 of all its oil through this single passage every day. Europe was getting between 12 and 14% of its total liquefied natural gas through this same route. And countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar were all depending on this corridor to reach their buyers around the world. Now, the conflict that brought us to this point started on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran in an operation called Operation Epic Fury, targeting military facilities, nuclear sites, and senior leadership. And Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening phase of those strikes. Iran responded right away with missile and drone strikes against Israel, American military bases, and Gulf states that were allied with Washington. The Strait of Hormuz became Iran's most powerful tool of response, and what followed became the largest oil supply disruption in recorded history. Every signal before February 28th suggested this conflict would not happen, but it did happen. And to understand why the strait stayed closed even after the ceasefire, we need to look at everything that happened between that first strike and the morning of April 9th. When the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28, 2026, the goal was to destroy Iran's nuclear program and reduce its military strength through a series of coordinated strikes. And the killing of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei in the opening hours was one of the most serious military actions taken against any country's leadership in modern history. Iran's response came quickly, and it was not just directed at Israel and American military bases. It was directed at the global economy itself through the Strait of Hormuz. And this is the part of the story that most news coverage completely missed. Iran did not just respond with missiles aimed at military targets. Iran used the Strait of Hormuz as a weapon against the entire world's energy system, and that decision changed everything about how this conflict would be understood and remembered. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued formal warnings, telling all ships to stay out of the strait, and those warnings were followed right away by physical attacks on any vessel that tried to move through the waterway. Iran carried out 21 confirmed attacks on merchant ships during the conflict, and placed sea mines throughout the strait, which made passage not just forbidden, but physically dangerous for any crew that was willing to try it. Tanker traffic through the strait dropped by approximately 70% within just a few days of the conflict beginning, and more than 150 ships anchored outside the strait rather than risk being hit. Major international shipping companies, including Maersk, CMA, CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd, stopped all transits through the strait and related routes completely, and the financial cost of even attempting to pass through became very large very quickly. Insurance costs for ships trying to pass went up from 0.125% to between 0.2 and 0.4% of the ship's total insured value per single transit, which translated to an additional cost of $250,000 per voyage for very large oil tankers. On March 2, 2026, a senior IRGC official publicly confirmed the strait was officially closed and warned any vessel that tried to enter it. The American-flagged vessel, Stena Imperative, was struck twice while at port in Bahrain, killing one port worker and injuring 2 others. On March 19, 2026, Dubai crude oil reached $166 United States dollars per barrel, the highest price ever recorded in history, and the United States military announced on that same day that it was beginning a military effort specifically to reopen the strait by force. That effort did not fully succeed before the ceasefire talks began in early April, and the reason it did not succeed connects directly to what happened on the morning of April 9th when Iran made a decision that shocked the world. The ceasefire announcement came on the evening of Tuesday, April 8th, 2026, and it came at a moment when both sides were under very heavy pressure. President Trump had publicly threatened to destroy Iran's civilization if its leaders did not reach a deal to reopen the strait. And that threat had a specific deadline attached to it that was getting very close. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt explained that Iran had first delivered proposals that were not acceptable, but then came back with a second set of proposals that were closer to the deadline and described as more reasonable. President Trump decided the second proposal was something that could be worked with, and the ceasefire was announced before the deadline ran out, with Washington telling the world that the agreement had stopped the conflict and secured the reopening of the world's most important waterway. The terms that Washington stated were straightforward. Iran would stop all attacks, allow ships to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, and enter into nuclear talks with the United States. Trump wrote on Truth Social that the ceasefire only worked if Iran agreed to the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the strait. Financial markets around the world responded right away because they believed the energy crisis was ending. Brent crude oil dropped 13.29% to settle at $94.75 per barrel, which was the biggest single-day drop since April 2020. West Texas Intermediate crude fell 16.41% to settle at $94.41 per barrel. Stock markets across Asia and Europe went up sharply, and the general feeling in financial markets was that the worst of the disruption was now behind the world. But there was something important that nobody in Washington was telling the public clearly on that evening, and it became very visible the next morning when the ship tracking data came in. Iran's state-run Fars news agency reported that the country was closing the strait again, and this happened less than a single day after the ceasefire had been announced. Iran said the reason was that Israel had continued its military operations in Lebanon after the ceasefire was signed, and Iran considered those operations a direct violation of the agreement. Iranian Foreign Minister Sayed Abbas Araghchi stated publicly that the United States had to choose between a genuine ceasefire or continued war carried out through Israel, and that it simply could not have both at the same time. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responded by saying the ceasefire did not extend to Lebanon, and that operations there would continue regardless. Lebanon's health ministry reported that at least 180 people were killed when Israel struck residential and commercial areas in central Beirut on the very same day the ceasefire was supposed to be holding. And the gap between what the agreement was supposed to mean and what was actually happening on the ground was becoming very hard for anyone to ignore. Washington's response to the closure reports was confusing and full of contradictions that made the situation even harder to understand for people watching from around the world. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters the reports of closure were not true, and then within the same briefing, she declined to answer a direct question about who currently controlled the Strait of Hormuz. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth stated the strait was open. Top economic advisor Kevin Hassett told Fox Business that getting even a single large tanker through would provide a large portion of the supply that was missing from global markets, which was itself a statement that showed clearly how far the reality on the water was from what officials had been telling the public. The ship tracking data told a completely different story from the one Washington was presenting, and that data is where the truth about this ceasefire was actually visible to anyone paying attention. Now, if you want to understand whether the Strait of Hormuz was actually open after the ceasefire, you do not need to listen to what any government was saying, because the ship tracking data tells you everything you need to know, and what that data showed was a reality that was very different from the statements coming out of Washington. Before the war began, more than 130 vessels passed through the strait every single day as a completely normal part of global trade. In the first 24 hours after the ceasefire was announced, only 5 bulk carriers went through the waterway, according to data from the market intelligence firm Ceasefire. On Thursday, 7 vessels went through, which was still a very small number compared to what normal traffic looked like before the war started. S&P Global Market Intelligence reported that only 9 vessels had passed through the strait across all of Wednesday and Thursday combined. And according to Ceasefire analyst Matt Smith, only 2 tankers had actually gone through the waterway since the ceasefire was announced, and one of those 2 tankers was Iranian-owned. Lloyd's List Intelligence reported that more than 600 vessels, including 325 tankers, were still stuck inside the Persian Gulf because the strait remained effectively blocked. According to analysis from Ceasefire, the strait had previously been handling approximately 15 million barrels per day of crude oil and petroleum product exports from the Middle East region. With the strait blocked, approximately 8 million barrels per day were sitting inside the Gulf, with no way to reach the buyers who were waiting for them. Iraq was hit the hardest among all the oil-producing countries in the region, and the numbers make that very clear. Before the war, Iraq was sending approximately 4 million barrels of oil per day through the strait to reach its buyers. That number fell all the way down to approximately 900,000 barrels per day as the conflict continued, with only a single pipeline running to Turkey, providing any meaningful way for Iraqi oil to reach the market. 2 Chinese oil tankers carrying Iraqi and Saudi crude moved toward the entrance of the strait on Thursday morning and then stopped right at the entry point without going through. The vessels were openly showing their Chinese ownership and crew information through their automatic identification systems, which suggested their owners wanted Iranian authorities to clearly see who they were before deciding whether to attempt the passage. Maritime intelligence firm Windward confirmed that coordination with Iranian armed forces was still needed for all transits through the strait, and this remained true regardless of what the ceasefire agreement said on paper. Iran confirmed that this arrangement was operating within what it called technical limitations, without explaining what those limitations actually were. And the message going out to the entire shipping industry was very clear. Iran was still the one deciding who could pass and who could not. And behind all of these numbers, there were real people whose lives had been completely turned around by this blockage. People who had nothing to do with the decisions that started this conflict. Rex Pereira, a 28-year-old crew member from Mumbai, had been stuck aboard an oil tanker for more than 1 month when he finally managed to get 3 emergency visas to leave the vessel. His journey home took more than 48 hours and required him to travel from an Iraqi port through Saudi Arabia and Kuwait before he could finally reach his family. He said the ships near the strait simply wanted to get out, and that most crew members had not agreed to be part of a war when they signed their work contracts, and all they wanted was to go home. Here is where the story gets even more serious, because what became clear in the days after the ceasefire announcement was that Iran was not simply using the Strait of Hormuz as a short-term pressure tool that it would give up once the fighting stopped. Iran was turning the world's most important energy waterway into a long-term source of money and political power. And this is the part of the story that almost no major news coverage was explaining clearly to its audience. Iranian officials demanded that ships pay a toll of up to $2 million United States dollars per vessel to Tehran in exchange for permission to pass through the strait. Analysis of that toll structure showed it could bring in up to $100 billion per year for Iran, if applied to the normal volume of traffic that used the waterway before the war. The money from these tolls would go directly to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the military organization that was enforcing the closure and running Iran's ballistic missile program. The language that Iran's military used to describe this arrangement was very deliberate and worth paying close attention to. Iran's military command stated through state-owned Press TV that it would manage and intelligently control the Strait of Hormuz going forward, and this was not the language of a temporary wartime measure, but rather the language of a long-term arrangement in which Iran was placing itself as the permanent authority over who could use the waterway and who could not. The CEO of Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, Sultan Ahmed Al Jaber, who is also a government minister of the United Arab Emirates, responded to this with a public statement that was very direct. He said the strait was not open, that access was being restricted, controlled, and made conditional on Iran's approval, and that Iran had made clear that ships must get its permission before attempting to pass. He said every day the strait remained in this condition, the results for economies and ordinary households worldwide would keep getting worse. Iran also put out guidance directing vessels away from the main shipping lane in the strait, pointing to the danger of sea mines that had been placed in the primary transit route. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a formal statement directing all ships to take different routes to avoid possible contact with sea mines, which effectively confirmed that Iran had placed mines in portions of the strait's main channel, making the original route genuinely dangerous for any crew that tried to use it. Many analysts going into the ceasefire had expected Iran's position to become weaker once the bombing stopped, but the opposite happened, and the reason why is something that senior energy analysts explained in very plain terms. Gregory Brew, a senior analyst at the Eurasia Group who focuses on Iran and energy markets, said that despite weeks of American bombing, Iran was actually in a stronger position after the war than it had been before the war began because Iran had shown the world that it could close the strait whenever it chose to do so. He said this ability gave Iran the power to affect the global economy at any moment it decided to use that option, and that Iran's control of the strait was worth more to the country than its nuclear program, its missile program, and all of its regional armed groups put together, because no other tool gave Iran the same direct hold over the economies of every country on Earth at the same time. What the closure of the Strait of Hormuz did to the global economy was not something that stayed inside the energy industry. It spread across every region of the world and touched industries and ordinary people who had no direct connection to oil or shipping, and the full size of those effects was still not understood by most of the public even weeks into the crisis. Oil tanker traffic through the strait had fallen sharply during the war, and analysts at leading financial institutions and energy research firms were describing what was happening as the largest disruption to global oil supply in recorded history, going beyond even the oil disruptions of the 1970s in terms of the total amount of supply that was removed from the market in such a short period of time. When more than 36 oil traders, shipping company leaders, brokers, and industry advisors were asked about the situation during the crisis, they all gave the same answer. The world had not yet understood how serious this was, and the longer the closure continued, the worse the effects would become. United States government officials and analysts at major financial institutions were having serious conversations about the possibility that oil prices could reach $200 per barrel if the strait stayed closed for an extended period of time. Goldman Sachs said publicly that if the closure continued for another month, Brent crude oil would stay above $100 per barrel for the entire remainder of 2026. At the time of the ceasefire announcement, Brent crude was trading at approximately $97 per barrel after falling from its wartime peak, but prices were going back up again as markets started to understand that the strait had not actually reopened, and the supply disruption was continuing with no clear end in sight. The situation with liquefied natural gas was actually even more serious than the oil supply disruption, and this is the part of the economic story that most coverage was not giving enough attention to. The Strait of Hormuz is the route through which approximately 1/5 of the entire global supply of liquefied natural gas travels, and most of it comes from Qatar. Unlike oil, liquefied natural gas has no other route that can replace the strait at any meaningful scale. And there are very few stored reserves of liquefied natural gas that governments can release to cover the shortage the way they can release oil from national stockpiles. European countries were facing the possibility of diesel shortages within weeks, as the fuel that normally came through the strait stopped arriving, and countries across Asia were already beginning to store and ration fuel supplies because they could see what was coming. The International Energy Agency, representing 32 member countries, made a unanimous decision to release 400 million barrels of oil from emergency national reserves, which was about 4 days of total global oil use. The United States temporarily lifted restrictions on Russian oil sitting in floating storage at sea to make it available to more buyers around the world. Saudi Arabia pushed its east-west pipeline to the Red Sea port of Yanbu to its highest possible capacity, moving approximately 4 to 4.5 million barrels per day by that route, and the United Arab Emirates continued sending approximately 1.5 million barrels per day through the port of Fujairah. But all of these efforts combined still fell well short of replacing the 8 million barrels per day that remained stuck inside the Persian Gulf, with nowhere to go and no clear timeline for when that would change. When you look at the gap between what the United States government said it had achieved and what the data was showing on the water, it becomes clear that Washington made some serious errors in how it approached the military campaign against Iran, and understanding those errors is important to understanding why the ceasefire produced the outcome it did, rather than the outcome Washington had described to the public. The Trump administration made two decisions at the very start of the conflict that analysts said significantly limited its options as the war developed and grew more complicated. The first decision was to rely entirely on air power to push Iran into accepting American terms, without putting in place a large naval force that was capable of physically reopening the strait if Iran refused to do so. The second decision was to carry out the campaign without building a wide alliance of partner nations, which meant the United States could not put together the kind of combined naval presence that might have given it the ability to challenge Iran's hold over the waterway in a way that Iran would take seriously. The result of these two decisions was that Iran kept physical control of the strait throughout the entire conflict, and continued to hold that control even after the ceasefire was signed. Alex Vatanka, a senior fellow and Iran specialist at the Middle East Institute in Washington, said Iran's approach was planned and deliberate, and that Iran made sure the effects of the war were felt directly by American consumers and the American economy by holding the one corridor through which the world's energy supply moved every day. By keeping control of the strait, Iran made sure that rising oil prices and higher fuel costs reached American households, regardless of how the air campaign was going over Iranian territory. And that strategy worked exactly as Iran intended it to. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Dan Kane stated at a Pentagon briefing that the United States military had met its goals in Iran, but confirmed that the ceasefire was a pause in the fighting rather than an end to it, and that American forces were staying in position, ready to start combat operations again if needed. President Trump wrote on Truth Social that all United States ships, aircraft, and military personnel would remain in place in and around Iran until the terms of the agreement were fully followed, and stated that if those terms were not met, military action would start again at a larger scale than anything seen before. Vice President J.D. Vance was sent to Islamabad along with Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to lead talks with Iranian officials that were scheduled for the weekend following the ceasefire announcement, and what came out of those talks would determine whether the pause held or whether the conflict started again. So, where does all of this leave the world right now? The 14-day ceasefire created a short window in which the core questions about the Strait of Hormuz needed to be worked out through talks rather than military action. And the stakes of those talks were higher than almost any other conversation happening anywhere in the world at that moment, because the outcome would affect the global economy directly and very quickly. According to data from the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, 230 fully loaded oil tankers were waiting inside the Gulf to sail out through the strait, carrying hundreds of millions of barrels of oil that buyers around the world needed urgently. Every additional day those tankers could not move added costs for ship owners, extended delays for buyers, and kept pushing global oil prices higher in ways that ordinary people in every country were already feeling at fuel stations and in their daily expenses. The plan by Iran and Oman to charge tolls on vessels passing through the strait introduced an entirely new question that had no clear answer under existing international maritime law. The strait had always been considered an international waterway, where the right of passage applied to all ships without any payment, and turning it into a toll route would represent a lasting change to how global shipping had always worked. American partners in the Gulf, particularly the United Arab Emirates, were watching the Islamabad talks with serious concern because they understood that a ceasefire which left Iran in long-term control of the strait would change the balance of power in the entire region for years to come. So, now you understand why this conflict is not really about Iran's nuclear program and not really about the military strikes that happened over Iranian territory. It is about who controls the next generation of global energy and the political power that comes with controlling it. And that question was not answered by the ceasefire. The United States and Israel carried out an intensive military campaign against Iran that destroyed military infrastructure and killed senior leadership. But when the ceasefire was signed on April 8, 2026, Iran still controlled a 21-mile corridor through which 20% of the world's oil supply travels every single day. The Islamabad talks between American and Iranian officials will determine what comes next, and the outcome of those talks will affect oil prices, energy security, and the political order of the entire Middle East for years ahead. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next development in this story is coming very soon.